James, just give us a time, right here.
That's good.
Breaking news this hour in Suffolk. Angela Pollina, convicted of the murder of 8-year-old Thomas Valva, is about to be sentenced. She could get 25 years to life in prison. This is a look inside the courtroom in Riverhead. It looks as if the sentencing is about to start. So let's go there live for a moment to see what is there. Seems like we're waiting for Angela Pollina to enter the courtroom again. She's being sentenced today. She could face up to 25 years to life for the murder of 8-year-old Thomas Valva. Of course, Thomas Valva died after spending a night in a freezing garage over in Moriches. Just a moment, we're about to listen in. This here is her attorney. Looks like he is not speaking yet. He's just waiting at the podium. As we wait again, Angela Pollina.
All right, well, what we're looking at is the lawyers are going to take their places up near the tables. The defendant will be sitting on their side. The prosecutors will be on the other side. I would assume, based on what we're seeing, that we are waiting for the judge to enter the room. This is the judge that has presided over the trial of Angelina Pollina. I would point out that the judge who tried her ex-fiance, Michael, was a different judge. So we're going to be hearing from this judge, Tim Izai. By the way, he is a former prosecutor. He's also a former Brookhaven Town Council person. The other thing I would point out here is that as of yet, we will be hearing live what the prosecution's suggested penalty for Angela Pollina should be. They have not said so before, so we will be hearing that live as well. Looks like the judge is up on the bench.
Now, Newsday columnist Joy Brown, I have to ask you this. In the coming days, we've heard from this attorney, from Angela's defense attorney, saying that Angela has been saying that she is upset because she feels she's innocent. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, a jury has found her basically equally culpable to Michael, her ex-fiance, who is now serving a 25 years to life sentence. So a jury of her peers has said that she is not innocent. Of course she has, and her attorney says she will appeal. She has that right. But today isn't about whether she's guilty or innocent. Today is what will the judge decide and determine in order that the penalty be for the jury's decision that she is equally culpable or that she is guilty in the death of 8-year-old Thomas Valva.
Now, let's talk about the process. Do you think we'll hear any impact statements today?
I don't know whether we'll hear any impact statements. Now, just so you know, Thomas's mom has filed suit against the county and a lot of other people and institutions in terms of the death. But we'll find out whether we hear impact statement. But this would be the time when we would hear an impact statement if someone has chosen to do so. But again, we don't know what's going on from the prosecution side because they haven't told us whether or not there will be impact statements, and the prosecution would be the ones to let the judge know, and the judge likely already knows whether or not someone is going to stand up and speak on behalf of Thomas.
Now, we understand that this trial, this case has been wide-ranging, not only affecting, obviously, Thomas and his family, but also the child services system. Could you talk a little bit about that? Well,
I mean, you had a case here where you have an 8-year-old who was, they say, abused, but when you looked at the evidence we saw videotape in court, you saw text messages, it looked more like he and his brother were tortured. We have never, ever publicly been a witness to any of this before. Now let's see what is going on here. It looks like
she's coming in.
The defendant, Angelina Pollina, is coming into the courtroom from that side area there. That's where she would have been held. You notice the court officers that are near her.
All right, let's listen in.
Your Honor, initially, I would just like to know for the record, we did send a victim impact letter to Justina Valva, who is a biological mother, obviously, of Thomas Valva. We did not hear back from her. I have not heard from her in quite some time, but I understand that.
Probation was not able to reach her either.
That is correct, but I would like the court to know, I did meet Ms. Valva when this case first arrived in our office. I met with her on a couple of occasions, and I just want to clear for the record, it was very clear to me how much that lady loved her son, all 3 of her children, and the profound loss that she suffered on January 17th of 2020. I just want that clear for the record.
I think it couldn't be more clear.
Thank you. Your Honor, I also just want to point out I have had an opportunity to read the PSI in its entirety, and two things stand out to me from that I'd just like to point out for the court. The first one is, not once did the defendant indicate in any way, shape, or form that she was sorry for what happened to 8-year-old Thomas Valva, an 8-year-old little boy who has now lost his life. Not once does she indicate that she's simply sorry that that happened, a little boy who lived in her house for 2 years. Not even sorrowful that he died. Nothing. And in addition to that, the second thing that stands out to me, there were 5 other children living in that household. Not once does she indicate that she was sorry for what they endured and what they witnessed in that house. She testified, I was evil and I was cruel, and those children witnessed it. Not once does she indicate that she is sorry for that either. And that speaks volumes, in my humble opinion, about who this defendant is and why I am standing here today recommending 25 years to life. Your Honor, the staff at the East Moriches Elementary School, Thomas and Anthony's teachers, the principal, the school psychologist, they're all here in the courtroom today. They testified twice regarding this matter. They all tried to help those 2 little boys, both Thomas and Anthony. They recognized the issues that they had. They did the best they could. They flooded CPS with calls. They got no help, but thank God for them, because that's the only place those 2 little boys found any love or support in their very, very short little lives. And after 3 years of looking at the videos and listening to the voices and reading the text messages, trying to make sense of what does not make any sense at all, something our hearts do not want to believe, but our brains force us to. We have to accept it because of the Nest video and the text messages from the defendant's cell phone that made something that is the stuff of horror movies a reality for Thomas and Anthony. Thomas, who was just 8 years old when he died, and Anthony was just 10 years old. Video and text messages that the defendant admitted under oath were authentic and accurate, her words and her actions. We saw the photo that Thomas's teacher, Kelly Wilson, took the day before he died. His smile, his thumbs up, telling us that Thomas was still young and innocent and thought that goodness and love could return to his life. Except that it wasn't. Because what we know from the evidence in this case, beyond any doubt, is that Thomas wasn't surrounded by love the day that he died, as he should have been. He was surrounded by nothing other than pure evil, as admitted to by this defendant. The redness of his hand and cheeks was symbolic of that evil, as I argued to the jury, a result of the horrific living conditions he had been fighting day in and day out, as this defendant admitted in her testimony. When he wasn't at school, Thomas was exiled to the freezing cold garage, the freezing cold cement floor. He was sleeping, eating, doing his homework in the garage along with Anthony. They had no blankets, no pillows, no mattress. That was because of the defendant. They were wearing pull-ups instead of being allowed to use one of the 4 bathrooms inside the house. And they were washing in the backyard in cold water and freezing temperatures because of this defendant. And the morning Thomas died, just to remind the court, it was 19 degrees outside. Your Honor, again, in my most humble opinion, Thomas was a profile in courage. He stared down the faces of evil he endured each day, the faces of his own father, and this defendant, who was the mother figure in his life for the 2 years prior to his death. Thomas bravely battled a war. His body ultimately lost to hypothermia, all brought on by this defendant's cruelty. As Your Honor considers the sentence to be imposed on this defendant, please consider how 8-year-old Thomas spent what should have been special events in the last months of his short life. His last birthday on September 14th of 2019, he was chastised by this defendant because his teacher, Mrs. Wilson, was kind enough to bring in sweets in celebration of Thomas's birthday. His last Halloween on October 31st of 2019, he was dressed as a prisoner, which he was. His last Thanksgiving in 2019 was spent in the garage with Anthony. And he wondered what Black Friday was, as we all heard when we listened to that particular audio from November 26th of 2019. His last Christmas in 2019 was spent day in and day out in the garage, as the defendant admitted. And after that vacation, Thomas and Anthony both came back to school a couple of weeks before Thomas died. And as the teachers described for you, they were unkempt, disheveled, tired, cold, limping at times, emotional, throwing up one morning, and smelling of urine and feces. I can only imagine how much worse it would have been had Thomas and Anthony not had each other to endure the cold and the dark together in those last days as Thomas lay dying on that cold garage floor. Imagine how much more frightening and lonely it would have been. Thomas unwittingly sacrificed his life so that his brothers and those other poor children who lived in that house would be saved. And I'd ask Your Honor to consider what Thomas lost when he died at the age of 8. He never went to junior high school. He never went to high school. He'll never learn how to drive. He'll never have a first date. He'll never buy his first house. He'll never get married and have children. All the things that this defendant has been able to enjoy in her lifetime. And the stress of what he went under was testified to by Dr. Kaplan. Instead of being an otherwise happy, healthy 8-year-old little boy, he suffered from a stress-induced alopecia, a stress-induced chronic kidney infection, and a stress-induced involuted thymus. The stress caused all by this defendant's admittedly cruel and evil treatment of him. Thomas was an 8-year-old little boy who should have looked forward to playing with the dog, or watching his favorite TV show, or figuring out what Christmas gift to open next. Instead, he was figuring out how to stay warm in a freezing cold garage. He was forced to call this defendant Mom, and to use his words to get food. He was screamed at her and denied food when he didn't do what she wanted, when he didn't obey her irrational demands. And we know all that thanks to the next video. Your Honor, I would also ask you to consider, in addition to the 2 or 2.5 years of torture that he endured at the hands of this defendant prior to his death and while living under her household, and living with her while his father went off to work in the city. She's the one who put him in the garage. Never once said, you know what, boys, stay in your room. You don't have to go out there, your father won't know. Didn't do anything like that. Instead, she acknowledged in her testimony that even on the day that Thomas died, she owed him a duty of care. And yet, Thomas woke up in the garage the morning of his death in the same clothes he'd worn to school the day before, urinating and defecating on himself as he lay on the freezing cement garage floor dying of hypothermia. Not once did she ask if he was okay. Not once did she suggest that the boys come inside where it was warm. Not once did she offer the use of the bathroom to clean him up. Even on that one occasion, she couldn't show him kindness or mercy. But instead, she became enraged, and she made it all about her, as it always was, as we saw from the evidence in this case. To Michael Valva, she said, and you can't beat the shit out of him for peeing for me every fucking morning, right? It's a game with them, and it's fucking ridiculous. It's all over the floor. And then to Thomas and Anthony, you and you, I'm disappointed in both of you. I'm very upset. You pee for me, but you're good for your father. You're shitting for your father every time he's home. That's what she says to the 2 little autistic boys the morning that 8-year-old Thomas died. That's not someone who got stuck in the mud that morning. That's someone who was much in the play as ever. And that morning was no different than any other, except that Michael Valva happened to be home and not at work. Thomas was then forced outside to clean himself up because of the defendant. And I'm just going to point to one exchange that sums it all up. When Anthony knocked on the garage door, and the garage door was opened, and he said, Dad, can I have a drink of water, please? And Michael was fine with it until she got involved. And she said, you're giving him water before he goes on the bus? I never do that. Michael's immediate reaction? Take a drink at school. Doing exactly what she would do, as he always did. And he's culpable, and he's been punished for doing that, but it was her rules and her punishment imposed. And of course, then she told Anthony, don't act differently when your father's here. Never do I give him a sip in the morning. Bullshit. I'm always watching. No different because your father's home. Bullshit, Anthony. She wasn't stuck in the mud that day, as counsel argued. She ruled that household that day just like she did every day, with an iron fist in a tyrannical and admittedly evil, cruel fashion. She even knew that Thomas was hypothermic that morning. She explained it to her 7-year-old who didn't understand why Thomas couldn't walk. And she knew that he had fallen on cement pavers and had 2 gigantic lumps on his head, as Michael Valva told her. And tragically for Thomas, she stayed in the play and treated him as she always did, with a complete and utter disregard for his welfare. Not once did she offer to call a doctor or suggest calling 911, even though he was a quote-unquote bloody fucking mess, according to Michael Valva. Instead, she tried to manipulate that jury into believing that she held Thomas that morning and wiped away his tears. Well, Your Honor, you sat through the trial. That was belied by the evidence in this case. She repeatedly referred to Thomas and Anthony through text messages, most of them accompanying videos of the boys in the garage, referring to them as dirty, stinky, filthy, and disgusting. 8 and 10-year-old little boys who were under her care. On November 13th of 2019, garage stinks. I walked in, they both start getting dressed, and I told them to stop. I didn't ask you to get dressed. That's how she treated an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old. I don't care, I don't give a fuck. I'm not wiping asses. I told you I won't go in there, and I will not help. I threw their shakes at them, and that's it. I want my garage and home back the way it was. This is bullshit. I feel disgusted to go in my own garage. Those are her words. She didn't go in that garage on January 17th and hold that child. The night of January 3rd of 2020 at 7:59 p.m., both boys sleeping in the garage. January 4th of 2020 at 2:45 a.m. The defendant's words, the way Anthony behaves has nothing to do with not having a bed or blanket. Both boys sleeping in the garage that night. On January 5th of 2020, 12 days before Thomas died, I need to bleach the garage floor tomorrow, it's soaked. She didn't suddenly decide that she didn't mind sitting on the urine-soaked floor to hold Thomas, who in her words was filthy. On January 5th of 2020 at 7:38 a.m., everything is coming out of there, meaning the garage, books, clothes, etc. They too comfortable of a punishment because you, referring to Michael Valva, made it a home. There should not be one thing that belongs in a bedroom in there. That night, both boys sleeping on the garage floor, and she mocked Thomas. That SOB Thomas went in the dirty laundry basket, took the towel to cover himself. She sent a video of Thomas to Michael Valva, showing Thomas pulling the towel out and putting it over himself. It was 33 degrees that night. And then at 9:30 p.m., sending another video and text. Watch how he sneaks. Nothing phases him. And at 3:23 a.m., when Michael texted, it's real cold out, snowing, boys better not get hypothermia. And he said that Thomas told him they're both shivering. No response to that text message. And those boys continued to spend that night in the garage as well. The law requires that for her conviction of murder in the second degree, the defendant be sentenced to a term of state incarceration. Fortunately for her, Your Honor, unlike Thomas's prison cell, hers will come with access to a bathroom and a shower. She's guaranteed to have 3 meals a day. She won't have to use words to get them, and she will not have to eat them in her cell, and she won't have to eat crumbs off the floor. She'll have a mattress, a blanket, and a pillow, all the comfort she denied Thomas and Anthony. She'll be able to leave herself for recreation or go to the library. Ironically, prison life will be better than the hell she subjected 8-year-old Thomas and 10-year-old Anthony to, and she will be surrounded by adults who will protect her from harm, something Thomas and Anthony experienced absolutely at school, absolutely not at home. And thankfully, there will be no children for her to manipulate and scream and curse at, and no children for her to inflict torturous punishment on. Your Honor, the suffering this defendant inflicted that resulted in Thomas's death deserves nothing less than the maximum sentence of 25 years to life, and I would ask that you so sentence the defendant at this time. And I appreciate your indulgence. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly. Mr. Toohey?
Judge, thank you. I want to be very, very brief, Judge. Just say, I want to talk about my client's, her lack of criminal record her entire life. Before her union with Mr. Valva, she lived a good life. She raised her 3 daughters. She was exclusively the parent in control of her 3 daughters, and she enjoyed a very close relationship with them. She comes from a very, very loving family, a mother and father who are immigrants that came over here. She's close with all her siblings. She worked at the same job for just about 20 years, where she had, my understanding, many, many friends, and she was in good standing and very well liked at her job. Her life changed dramatically when she met Mr. Valva. This became a situation where she had met him, he had moved into her house, and soon after that, he introduced his children to her. When she first met the boys, she met them in like in a pizza store, Judge, where they would go for an hour or 2, and the meetings they went very well. The father had just gotten some unsupervised visitation at the time, and she got along well with the boys, and she enjoyed being with them. She had really no other interaction with them. During the course of the summer that she first met Mr. Valva, her union became more complicated when she was diagnosed with cancer. She had to leave her job, and it was actually ironically Mr. Valva who had donated a portion of his liver to help save her life. So that union became very, very complicated. It was short after that, a month or 2 later on Labor Day, where Mr. Valva had obtained custody of the boys, and they had moved in. They had never slept over there. My client had never had the experience or the training in dealing with children of these challenges. And certainly, right from the bat, she went out, she decorated the rooms. She was all in on it. Obviously, from the testimony that occurred, this was a situation that wasn't managed well, and obviously things went south very quickly, and she couldn't manage it. I understand what Ms. Kelly said in terms of the pre-sentence report, where she never once expressed remorse. Obviously she has tremendous remorse for what happened to Thomas and for the treatment of Anthony. It's certainly difficult for her to express it sometimes when she's under this type of scrutiny. So one of the things she wanted me to point out, Judge, is it's been difficult for her to say she has remorse and to express those words, but obviously she certainly does. She's raised 3 daughters, she did care for the boys, and the treatment, she tried to get up to the court as best she could and to the jury and to explain what she had done was wrong. One of the things that I believe, and I want to just focus on briefly, is when she had said that, I was evil. And I think what she wanted to say is that she's not an evil person, but the acts of putting the boys in the garage became evil acts that she wanted to own up to. She didn't have to take the stand. She took the stand to try to own up to the things that she did that were wrong and to try to explain them and put them in context as best she could without making any excuses for her conduct and owning up to them. She's not a lawyer. She did the best she could, and she tried to explain it as best she could. Judge, based on all the factors and a lack of criminal record, the fact that obviously even with the minimum, she's going to spend a tremendous amount of time in jail. I'm going to ask the court to consider the minimum of 15 to life in this case. And without making any excuses for her conduct or what she did that was wrong, certainly Mr. Valva was an important part of this situation, and his conduct put matters in motion to such an extent that certainly caused the boy's death. If Mr. Valva wasn't there, Thomas would still be alive at this point. So I'd ask the court to consider that on all the factors and not sentence her to the maximum 25 years to life, but to consider 15 years to life based on all the testimony and its aggregate and all the background that the court had a chance to hear about Ms. Pollina.
Thank you, Mr. Toohey. Ms. Pollina, is there anything you wish to say before I pronounce sentence?
No, Your Honor.
No? All right. Ms. Pollina, like most people in this county, I was aware of this case from the trial, that spineless, poor excuse of a man, ex-fiance of yours. But it wasn't until I heard and saw what you said and did in this trial that I think we all realized how evil you really are and really were. And evil's not the word that I came up with. That's the word that you came up with to describe yourself, to describe the treatment of what you did to those poor little innocent boys. You tortured those boys. You tortured them. I looked up the definition of torture in the dictionary. You know what torture means? Something that causes agony or pain. The infliction of intense pain to punish, coerce, or afford sadistic pleasure. That's what you did. And never once, as Miss Kelly said, never once have you ever showed any sorrow or compassion for what happened to those little boys. I've had the opportunity to visit the prison where you will be sent. It's where all females in the state of New York go. My only regret, Ms. Pollina, is they don't have a garage there with no heat and no mattress and no blankets and no pillows. And what was it, Miss Kelly? Nothing that belongs in a bedroom. So where you could sleep the rest of your life, because that's where you deserve to be for the rest of your natural life. Ms. Pollina, as a result of you being convicted of murder in the second degree under count 1, it's a sentence in the court that you serve an indeterminate term of imprisonment with a maximum of your natural life and a minimum of 25 years. As a result of your being found guilty of count 2, it's a sentence in the court that you serve 1 year. As a result of your being found guilty of count 3, it's a sentence in the court that you serve 1 year. As a result of your being found guilty of count 4, it's a sentence in court that you serve 1 year. And finally, as a result of your being found guilty of count 5, it's a sentence in court that you serve 1 year. Those sentences to run concurrent with each other. You can advise your client.
Thank you, Judge. Ms. Pollina, you have the right to appeal your judgment and conviction and the sentence imposed upon you on this date by filing a notice of appeal in duplicate with the clerk of the court within 30 days of this date. An additional copy must also be served upon the district attorney. If you cannot appoint an attorney for this purpose, you may apply to the appellate division, 2nd Judicial Department, at 45 Monroe Place, Brooklyn, New York, and request that counsel be assigned to purpose.
In regards to the mandatory surcharge of $375,
Mr. Toohey,
Yes, that'd be civil charges.
you'll be reduced to a judgment.
let the record reflect the defendant is being served with the order of director and the surrender of all firearms, rifles, and shotguns, and in the back of the office.
Angela Pollina leaving the courtroom after being sentenced to 25 years to life, including more charges of 1 year each, all running congruent to each other. There was a lot to unpack there. I want to bring in Newsday columnist Joy Brown for us now, from what the prosecutor, Carrie Ann Kelly, said to what the defense had mentioned, and then lastly, a very passionate judge in this sentencing. So let's go through what the prosecutor resurfaced. What were some things that stood out to you?
Well, the things that stood out to me was she never says she was sorry. No sense of remorse, the prosecutor says. She talks about how the court says you're trying to make sense of what does not make any sense at all. She talked about horror stories, that these boys lived the stuff of horror stories. She talked about how the boy, Tom, he was not surrounded by love. He was surrounded by, in her words, pure evil.
That's right.
And she talked about Thomas, not just what he could have been, but what he was. And this kind of struck out to me. Thomas was a profile in courage, she said. He stared down the faces of evil. This little 8-year-old boy, she said. As far as the defendant, the prosecutor had a lot to say about her as well. She made it all about her. Listening to the tapes and reading the text messages. She talks about how she ruled that household as she did every day with an iron fist. And again, she talks about how basically that this defendant will have a better time, and the judge would later echo that in prison than she gave those little boys who lived in her home.
And the prosecutor Carrie Ann, was also getting choked up and emotional at certain points when she was talking about the evil and cruel fashion in which Angela Pollina treated him, and also what she said, a complete and utter disregard for his welfare. I want to move on to the defense now, because the defense pretty much painted this picture that because of Michael Valva, Angela was put in this situation because of the dynamic of the relationship changed when he gave a portion to his liver, donated a portion to his liver to her when she was diagnosed with cancer. What picture was he trying to paint?
Well, what he's trying to do is reframe, and that's what a good defense attorney is supposed to try to do. I mean, he, countered that although it's difficult for her to say, she has expressed remorse. Because remorse or lack thereof is an element in trying to determine what the sentencing is. Much has been made of her own testimony about I was evil. He tried to reframe that as her saying, well, the acts were evil, and she's owning up to those evil acts. And again, no surprise here. I'm sure this will come up in the appeal as well. She is still putting the bulk of the blame on the boy's father, Michael Valva.
Yeah, and the defense bringing up that she raised 3 daughters as well, and that in his words, if Michael wasn't there, Thomas would still be alive at this point. Now let's talk about Angela. We saw that she was sad, obviously, but then when the judge talked to her, you could hear in her voice that she was tearful. But the judge had made his decision. He was very straightforward in how he felt about this case. He said after the details of this case, he understood how evil you really are and were. Tell me about the judge's
Well,
statements.
let's talk about the judge, but let's talk about Angelina just a little bit more first. She kept her head down for most of it. You could see her jaw clench, and you could hear her sniffling. I don't know whether she was crying or not because I wasn't in the courtroom, and the only words we heard from her during this entire proceeding is when the judge asked her,
Yes, Judge.
if you have anything to say, and she said no.
Oh, no, Judge, rather.
No, Your Honor. That's what she said. Now, as for the judge, he was adamant, and he was passionate, as you pointed out, in putting down the sentence. What he said was, hey, I heard about this like everybody else, but he sat in that courtroom and he listened to all the evidence and the testimony. He listened to her testimony, listened to the videos, saw the text messages. And what he said to her, and he was speaking directly to her, he says, until I heard all of this, he says, he didn't understand, he didn't really know just how evil you really are. Just how evil you really are. Then he goes on to tell her, you tortured those boys. You tortured them. And then he goes on to say, hey, I looked up what torture means. And again, he's speaking to her. And again, he doesn't take what the attorney is dishing out. He tells her, never once here have you ever shown any sorrow or compassion for those boys.
He also mentioned that he visited the prison where she was staying, and in his words, he says, my only regret is that they don't have a garage there, because that obviously is mimicking what she had done and Michael had done to those boys. Now, I want to ask you, it seems like this is the closing of the book, but it's not.
No.
So when are we going to hear more about this case? What comes next?
Well, what comes next is, as the lawyer said at the end, there is an intent to appeal this. He can appeal the conviction, he can appeal the sentence. So there's going to be more going on over there. In addition to that, you've got a couple of other things going on involving the courts. The boy's mom has filed a civil suit against the count in Suffolk County and other parties in relation to Thomas's death. So that's going to go ongoing. In addition to that, you had a lot of other entities in the county. There was, at one point, there was a rushed urgency. We have to do something about this. We have to do something about this. And as my colleague David Olson points out in today's Newsday, there's a lot still to be done, and there was a lot that wasn't done.
Let's talk about that, and let's talk about David Olson. I want you to stay here because another big aspect of this story, as you mentioned, is the investigations it has triggered into the child welfare services in Suffolk. So Newsday investigative reporter David Olson, he's going to join us now. He just completed an in-depth report on this part of the story. So welcome, David. So David, let me ask you, what is happening with those investigations?
Well, there are several that were planned back in 2020. One from the state, Office of Children and Family Services, was completed, but the state is not releasing that to the public. It looked at what happened with Thomas's death and what happened with Child Protective Services, which had been monitoring the situation in the Valva household for years. There's also the District Attorney's Office. They said there is an investigation ongoing, but the results have not been released yet. There's also the Suffolk Legislature that formed a task force back in 2020 to look into Thomas's death and to look into the CPS system. The last time they met, though, was in late 2021, although I was told that they are going to meet again at some time in the near future. And then there's also the state court system that in 2020 told Newsday that they were going to launch an investigation because the mom, Justina Zupko Valva, had lost custody to Michael Valva back in 2017. They're going to look into that as well as visitation issues. There was a judge handling visitation issues. And even though they said in 2020 they were going to launch an investigation, it never happened. And they told me at this point, it's unclear whether it will happen.
David, let me ask you something. In terms of the state report, why is that being kept a secret?
Well, the State Office of Children and Family Services told me they do something called the best interest determination for what's called the child fatality report. And in this case, they decided not to release it to the public, in part because of what they said, the chance for humiliation of the surviving siblings. But on the other hand, the lawyer for Justina Zupko Valva, who, as you mentioned, Joy, has filed a civil suit against Suffolk CPS, among others, has told me they want this to be released.
And so from what you've seen, does it look like any of these investigations will actually result in changes to the system anytime soon?
It's hard to say because obviously these results have not been released as yet, and some investigations are not complete. In the case of the state investigation, which was completed in 2021, they did tell Suffolk CPS about some changes they needed to make. And according to the state, they have made changes. It includes things like more partnership with law enforcement, better supervision, better documentation of cases, things along those lines. And the state said that that's already been done, and there have been improvements in Suffolk. Suffolk also, the county legislature passed this CPS Transformation Act, which did institute some reforms in CPS, including some maximum number of cases each caseworker should have. So that was instituted. In terms of further changes, it's hard to say because there's really no way to know when any of these investigations will be complete and what they're going to find, and as to whether there'll be any recommendations beyond what's already been done.
Now, David, we understand you're working on other stories on this topic. So what can we expect? I believe we lost.
Basically, what happened in the lead up to Thomas's death over a period of years. How, for example, CPS often focused much more on the mother rather than on the father. And obviously it's the father and Angela Pollina who murdered Thomas. A lot of the focus is on the mother, and we're looking to why that was so and what happened in the lead up to his deaths. And we're also going to look at both counties' Child Protective Services systems, both in terms of the number of cases. Those numbers have improved.
To read David's story,